Our next speaker is Stephen Gilchrist, and he is speaking to us about carriers of culture. So Stephen belongs to the Yamatji people of the Ngara language group at northwest Western Australia. Stephen is an associate lecturer in Indigenous art at the University of Sydney. He's also a prolific writer and curator, and he's worked with Indigenous Australian collections across Australia, but also internationally at places like the British Museum and at the Hood Museum. So please join me in welcoming Stephen.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thanks for the conveners for inviting me today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people, the women, children and men of the grass tree on whose customary lands we're now gathered. This place was named by the Gadigal, for the Gadigal, because of the Gadigal, and I pay my deep respect to the ancestors of the past, present and future, who have been keen keepers and couriers of this knowledge. I share a deep commitment to make invisible, audible and tangible the Indigenous knowledge embedded in and safeguarded through place. To share this land is to share a predicament. To my mind, artists and the people who have been paying attention to them have played such an important role in sustaining the pursuit of our questions about this predicament. The paper that I want to present today is based on my experience curating an exhibition at the Harvard Art Museums a couple of years ago in 2016. I had always considered myself a curator of contemporary art working predominantly with collections of post-1970s work within art galleries. So this exhibition for me was an opportunity to work with a historic collection that was the major lender to the exhibition, but within the art museum at the Harvard Art Museums. And to think about some of the complexities of working with and alongside historic objects. The exhibition was everywhere in the eternal present from Indigenous art in Australia and was essentially about Indigenous temporality, about imagining the world otherwise. And I wanted to look at the interpretive framework around 4 Coolamans that I included in the exhibition to break down the disciplinary monopolisation of knowledge endorsed by the separation of art from artefact, and to think about the temporal and geographical displacements of these objects. So how they have been seen historically and how they could be seen. Despite significant achievements in new museological formations that began in the late 1980s and early 1990s, it remains no easy task to reactivate culture within historical museums informed by archaeological and ethnological methodologies. Indigenous writers on museological practices embrace anthropomorphic metaphors that insist on the cultural subjectivity and ancestral materiality of museum objects. In the words of artist Julie Goff, objects are resonant with the intentions and language of their makers and the places in which they were used. This foundational recognition of the vitality of cultural objects and the respect they command underlies contemporary approaches to Indigenous curation. The museum is not merely a contact zone, which infers colonial co-implication. It is a contract zone of call and response that is underwritten by Indigenous cultural values. Indigenous curators must mediate what Senior Curator of Southeastern Aboriginal Collections at Museum Victoria, Kimberley Moulton, describes as the echoes and energies of objects in ways that are culturally respectful and meaningful. This call and response is not just an extension of Indigenous knowledge systems, it is also an enactment of Indigenous systems of knowledge management. Working with either historic collections or contemporary objects demands a commitment to the unvoiced dimensions of works of art, their cultural signification, biographical elements, and political potency. Indigenous curation is premised on this cultural mandate to speak with and listen to objects. When you are symbolically given the keys to these museum collections, you unlock the door, step inside, and realise it is haunted. The museum is a site of ancestral and colonial restlessness. Curation is not a matter of calming the spirits, but honouring their ancestral presence and being attentive to their locational and temporal displacements. It is a privilege to work with these ancestral objects, but this privilege is complicated by the reality of the conditions of their assembly, which are often described euphemistically as collecting. This neutralising word obscures asymmetrical power dynamics and occludes the problematics of consent. I remember the first time, this is an image of the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard, which was the major partner to the exhibition. And I remember the first time I was taken through these stores. I pulled out drawers, looking, smelling, and listening to which object spoke to me. Curator Gilda Andrews describes the feelings that Indigenous peoples often experience within museum stores. Those rooms are overwhelming, confusing, profound and confronting. They are time capsules placing anyone with 1 degree of separation to moments of intensity we as Australians are yet to fully grasp collectively. I eventually chose 13 objects from the Peabody's collection, and the exhibition featured 4 coolamans, 2 woven baskets, 1 fibre skirt, 6 pearl shells, 1 drum and 3 larrakitch. These objects were indicative of a life lived and mourned through objects, from the cradle to the grave. They became socially and culturally implicated within life cycles, lifespans and life ways of Indigenous women, children and men. For example, the coolamans are used to cradle babies. And conceptually, these representative objects intersect with cultural milestones and trigger sequences of ritually determined social practices that are often poised at temporal thresholds. Embedded within these liminal states of the physical and the spiritual, the secular and the ceremonial, these intermediate objects objects were and are cradled, worn, woven, and held close. In this way, touch and connection became important conceptual components of the exhibition, particularly with the works borrowed from the Peabody Museum. They had largely been forgotten in the stores. The 4 coolamans were enfolded into the transformation collection section of the exhibition, which was about ancestral narratives of transformation and the urgency with which museums need to transform their relationships to Indigenous people and the ways they define Indigenous collections. The coolamans all showed wear with accretions and staining, probably from food or other uses, and in these beautiful longitudinal grooves. I wanted to draw attention to the high degree of skill required to make these objects, but also the human touch associated with these objects, removed from everyday life. The blackened exterior of one of the coolamans reveals how its maker curved and shaped it over a fire. The interior is stained with these food substances, attesting to its daily use. While it is a functional object, a determined aesthetic preoccupation is evident. The patina of multiple histories is also evident in these works. Chronologies of biological time are made visible by the distinct growth rings that are present in the 4 wooden coolamans, but these markings demonstrate the passage of time and conversely also its suspension. The coolamans were in conversation with a painting by Ronnie Jumper, one of the youngest founding artists of the Papunya Collective. The painting concerns 2 ancestral women who placed their coolamans on the ground. The coolaman transformed into freshwater soakages, the rainwater that has seeped into the sandy ground. In places often thought to be without water, Indigenous people know where to locate permanent water sources. As evidenced by 2 women dreaming, this knowledge is a gift from the ancestors. Water is essential for physical life, as is ancestral presence and knowledge. Coolamans are used to both dig out the sand and carry the water. And with its 4 concentric rectangular forms, the painting portrays the infinite recursion of the everywhen. The contraction and expansion of these 4 motifs echoes the vitality of the land and celebrates the ancestral and human potential of transformation and creation. In this curatorial conversation, the Ceulemans are not just functional objects or artefacts suspended in museological time. They become reanimated with an unending ancestral signification of the past, gesturing emphatically towards the future. The refusal to be placed within the past and the refusal to be denied a future are important philosophical couplets of Indigenous curation. When Indigenous curators began contributing to the fields of art in the 1980s, they were predominantly interested in positioning Indigenous art within new definitional regimes, such as transitional art, hybrid art, non-traditional, and fine art. Much later, the category of the contemporary would be sought. This meaningful, intentional, and ongoing shift towards new intermediary categories must be seen as a defection from the discipline of anthropology, its much larger body of literature, and its legacy of temporal deceits. John Mundine dramatises these disciplinary orientations as tournaments taken up between the imperial houses of anthropology and art history. This choice is not really a choice at all. It is about the movement from one Western disciplinary formation to another. And it doesn't make sense for Indigenous peoples. Nevertheless, if anthropology epitomised fixity, art history, by contrast, offered futurity. For Indigenous people, it was clearly advantageous to choose the latter. The historical predicament of fixity within anthropological knowledge production was identified and understood through the term the ethnographic present, which was first put forward by Johannes Fabian in his 1983 publication, Time and the Other, How Anthropology Makes Its Object. As sociologist Charlotte Davis explains, the most common interpretation of the ethnographic present is undoubtedly the practice of developing analyses and generalizations from ethnographic research as if they represent a timeless description of the people being studied. Clearly, such an approach implicitly denies the historicity of these people. The data on which such analyses are based are required in an historically located encounter between an ethnographer and some individuals from among the people so described. Yet whereas the ethnographer moves on, temporally, spatially, and developmentally, the people he or she studied are presented as if suspended in an unchanging and virtually timeless state, as if the ethnographer's description provides all that is important or possible to know about their past and future. The term is derived from this interrogation of the discipline of anthropology and its temporalizing methodologies. Time is part of ethnography, and fieldwork is a temporal experience. As Fabian argued more than 30 years ago, the discipline of anthropology itself was founded on the contradiction of denying the coevality of its objects of study, even as it relied on direct interaction with contemporaneous people. In this way, people, groups, and ways of life under study became displaced from the present through these textual productions. As I understand it, the ethnographic present is essentially a critique of a literary contrivance that, through the use of the present tense, freezes cultures into unchanging and unchangeable socio-cultural conditions. It is not a critique of ethnography itself. The eternal present of my exhibition title at Harvard was not to argue for a never-ending temporal moment of the present, but to suggest that Indigenous people have always been contemporary, have never been out of time, and in contrast to the fieldwork implications of the dissolution of subject and object, Indigenous people have always been present to their own ways of constituting the world. The exhibition was therefore an attempt to restore Indigenous people not just to the present, but to the power of determining the present. Temporal displacements through interpretive containment both historicise and dehistoricise Indigenous people. Removed from history and erased from the present, Indigenous people simply cease to be, leaving only their artefacts behind. When Indigenous historical objects are converted into museum artefacts, they are also suspended in time. The South Australian Museum in Adelaide houses one of the foremost collections of Indigenous Australian cultural material. Yet its Indigenous displays went unchanged from 1914 until 1986. For too long, Indigenous people and culture has been imprisoned in historicising texts and lifeless museum exhibitions that have propagated the false narrative of an unchanging and unchangeable worldview. This narrative of stasis is an invention and tool of the coloniser and is at odds with the innovative and adaptive practices that have long been key to Indigenous survival, both pre- and post-contact. Grappling with these temporal and geographic displacements, the insistence on the adherence to Indigenous protocols is not just a straightforward cultural courtesy, but a recasting of museological claims of current and historic ownership. A critique of temporalising contractions, and an intensification of Indigenous cultural control. The inventory numbers that are painted directly onto objects, like the Coolamans in the Peabody collection, impose Victorian era ideas of ownership and categorisation, and these practices continue today. It could be argued that this practice attempts to supersede the expanded cultural biography of the object itself. To enable an authentic cultural biography through a curatorial philosophy of return and control, it is necessary to reclaim and rename objects that have become disconnected from their cultural, linguistic specificity. In many ethnographic collections, it is the collector's name that is recorded, but not the language or cultural group of the people related to the object. Furthermore, if geographical information is provided, it is invariably inscribed within European Australian cartographic traditions. In the 2018 exhibition catalogue for Colony, Australia 1770-1861, Frontier Wars, Indigenous curator Miles Russell Cook discusses the process of erasure and reveals the historical biases of museums, which results in this intentional anonymisation. He writes, "Rather than reading artist unknown ahistorically, merely as a placeholder designation for future attributions, we need to see this investigation into authorship as a way of exposing the historicity of collections and of a time when the name of a maker was not regarded as important enough to record, when the zeitgeist suggested that European fine art had authors, but most Aboriginal or Indigenous art was simply made." In the Everywhere exhibition, these collected details had to appear on every object label in accordance with most museum guidelines regarding credit lines. In contrast, there was often no artist name recorded and sometimes no attributed cultural group. When visitors encounter these objects, they experience them as objects without a people. But for Indigenous visitors, researchers and curators, this experience highlights people without objects. It is necessary to make these histories of erasure legible. Once these objects enter collections, a second displacement takes place. The appearance of these objects within museum collections, with consent or under duress, represents a significant geographical displacement. Provenance research is a way to track these displacements, but it does not undo them. Indigenous objects, whether they created on country or in diaspora, are bound to and governed by specific places. Returning objects to these places through differing typologies of repatriation is an important function of Indigenous curation. An important strategy within this project of return is to contribute to the renewing of connections between ancestral objects and contemporary peoples. The unorthodox ways in which historic museum collections are assembled through exchange, acquisition, donation, or theft mean that it is a difficult task for communities to find out exactly where many of the objects are located. Before repatriation can potentially be initiated by communities, this locational research must be communicated to them. The process of gaining permission mobilises a restorative process of knowledge recovery. It returns the objects to the keepers of community knowledge, but only symbolically puts those objects in these hands. There is still much more work to be done in the ongoing stewardship of these carriers of culture. Thank you.